Chapter 1. A whirl of lights and shadows. The night was alive with the sound of music and laughter, a melody of chaos that swirled through the air and mingled with the scent of sawdust and caramel. In the distance, the towering silhouette of the circus tent loomed against the twilight sky, its stripes of crimson and ivory rippling like the skirts of a dancer. Beneath the painted sky, the world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the magic of the moment. Sienna lingered at the edge of the fairground, her bare feet tracing patterns in the dirt. She wasn't supposed to be here yet, not until the crowds had swelled and the ringmaster's booming voice called her to the center stage. But something about the energy of the night had drawn her out early, a magnetism she couldn't resist. Her fingers toyed with the hem of her sequined leotard, the tiny crystals catching the fading light and scattering it like a million tiny stars. "Sienna," a sharp voice cut through the din, jolting her from her thoughts. She turned to see Clara, the costume mistress, striding toward her with a bundle of fabric tucked under one arm. "You'll ruin the mystery if they see you too soon. Get back inside." Sienna began, but Clara's raised brow silenced her. With a sigh, she slipped back into the shadows, away from the prying eyes of the early arrivals. The dressing tent was dimly lit, its corners crammed with trunks overflowing with feathers, sequins, and paint. Sienna's spot was tucked in the far corner, a small mirror propped up on a crate and surrounded by an assortment of powders and creams. She perched on a stool, staring at her reflection as she pinned a silk rose into her dark curls. The rose was crimson, like the blood that rushed to her cheeks whenever the trapeze soared beneath her feet. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of the circus wash over her. The call of the vendors, the chatter of families, the distant roar of the lions in their cages. This was her world, chaotic and beautiful, but it was also a prison. The ringmaster had made sure of that. A rustling sound broke through her reverie. She opened her eyes to find a shadow lingering at the entrance of the tent. "Who's there?" she called, her voice sharper than she intended. "Just me," came the reply, smooth and unhurried. Julian stepped into the light, his black coat trailing behind him like a specter. He always moved like he belonged somewhere else, a ghost passing through. Sienna couldn't decide if that made him more or less dangerous. "You're early," she said, her tone softening. "So are you," he countered, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. He held up a deck of cards, shuffling them with practiced ease. "Thought I'd warm up a bit. Care to join me?" She hesitated. Julian's tricks were mesmerizing, but they always left her feeling like she'd been pulled into a story she didn't fully understand. Still, she found herself nodding and following him to the small table set up in the center of the tent. He spread the cards in an elegant fan, each one gleaming in the dim light. "Pick one," he said, his voice low and inviting. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the cards before settling on one. The Queen of Hearts. She flipped it over, and Julian's expression shifted ever so slightly. "Fitting," he murmured. "The Queen of Hearts for the Queen of the Sky." Sienna's cheeks flushed, but she forced a laugh. "And what does that make you? The Joker?" "Perhaps," he said, his smile turning enigmatic. "But even the Joker has his secrets." Before she could respond, the sound of a bell echoed through the fairground, signaling the start of the evening's performances. Julian rose, slipping the deck of cards back into his pocket. "Break a leg out there," he said, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Sienna watched him go, the weight of his words settling over her like a second skin. As the crowd's cheers grew louder, she stepped into the night once more, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and unease. The spotlight awaited her, but so did the shadows, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Julian was hiding something far more dangerous than a simple deck of cards. Beneath the painted sky, The stage was set for a night that would change everything. Chapter 2. The Enchanted Encounter. The grand tent was a living creature, pulsing with life and light as the audience filed in. The faint scent of popcorn mingled with the sharp tang of sawdust, and the air hummed with anticipation. Children tugged on their parents' hands, their eyes wide with wonder as they took in the elaborate decorations that adorned the interior. Twinkling fairy lights lined the edges of the seats, casting a soft glow over the crowd. At the center of it all, the ringmaster stood beneath a single spotlight, his crimson coat glinting with gold trim as he raised his arms to quiet the growing buzz. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the most spectacular show on earth. His voice boomed, each word curling through the air like smoke. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound reverberating off the canvas walls. Backstage, Sienna stood poised on the narrow platform that led to her trapeze, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The ringmaster's introduction had become a nightly ritual, but the weight of the crowd's expectation never grew lighter. She flexed her fingers, adjusting her grip on the silken ropes that hung from the rafters. Her breath came in slow, deliberate pulls as she tried to calm her nerves. "You're up," a voice whispered from the shadows. Sienna turned her head to find Clara, the costume mistress, standing at the edge of the platform. Her sharp features softened with a rare smile. "Show them why you're the best." Sienna nodded, a flicker of gratitude warming her chest. With a final deep breath, she stepped forward into the spotlight. The crowd's applause swelled as she climbed higher, the wooden ladder creaking faintly beneath her weight. From this height, the world below seemed distant and dreamlike, a sea of upturned faces illuminated by the flickering lights. She reached the top platform and paused, gripping the ropes as she glanced at the audience one last time. Then, with a graceful leap, she launched herself into the air. For a moment, she was weightless. The ground disappeared, and the only thing that existed was the sensation of the air rushing past her skin and the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. She swung through the air with practiced precision, her body twisting and turning in perfect arcs. The audience gasped and cheered with each daring maneuver, their awe fueling her movements. On the final swing, she released the trapeze and spun into a double somersault before catching the next bar with effortless grace. The cheers reached a crescendo as she landed on the opposite platform, her chest heaving as she bowed to the crowd. As the applause continued, Sienna's gaze drifted to the side of the tent, where Julian stood in the shadows. He leaned casually against a wooden post, his arms crossed as he watched her with an intensity that made her heart skip. His dark eyes held a glimmer of something she couldn't quite place. Admiration, perhaps, or curiosity. Whatever it was, it unsettled her. When the curtain fell on her act, she descended the ladder and slipped backstage, her hands trembling as she wiped them on a towel. Julian was waiting for her near the props table, his presence impossible to ignore. "Impressive," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You make it look easy." "It's not," she replied, her tone more defensive than she intended. She tucked a stray curl behind her ear and avoided his gaze. "What do you want, Julian?" He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Just wanted to congratulate you. You have a way of capturing attention up there. Is that what you do? Study people so you can figure out how to fool them later?" she asked, a teasing edge creeping into her voice. He chuckled, the sound warm and rich. "Perhaps. Or maybe I just enjoy watching someone who's as good at their craft as I try to be at mine." The compliment caught her off guard, and she felt a blush creeping up her neck. She shook her head and busied herself with the towel, unsure how to respond. Before the moment could grow too heavy, the ringmaster appeared, his imposing frame filling the doorway. "Julian, you're on in 5, he barked. His sharp gaze flicked to Sienna. "And you, Don't let your head get too big. We've got another show tomorrow." As he stalked away, Julian turned back to her, his expression softening. "Looks like duty calls. See you later, Queen of the Sky." He disappeared into the maze of tints and props, leaving Sienna alone with her thoughts. She pressed a hand to her chest, where her heart was still pounding. There was something about Julian that unnerved her, a sense of mystery that both intrigued and warned her to keep her distance. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Sienna performed her second act, her movements mechanical as her mind wandered back to Julian's cryptic words and the intensity of his gaze. When the final curtain fell and the audience spilled out into the night, she found herself lingering near the edge of the fairground, staring up at the painted sky. The stars were faint against the inky darkness, their light dimmed by the glow of the circus. But Sienna found herself wishing she could reach them, that she could escape the confines of the tent and find a world where she wasn't bound by contracts and expectations. A world where she could be free. She didn't hear Julian approach until he was standing beside her, his presence as quiet as a whisper. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the sky. "It feels far away," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Not everything is as far as it seems," he said, his tone laced with meaning. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the circus fading into the background. For the first time in a long while, Sienna felt a flicker of hope. Beneath the painted sky, with Julian by her side, she wondered if freedom might not be as impossible as it seemed. Chapter 3. Strings of the Puppet Master. The next morning dawned with a hazy golden light filtering through the thin canvas walls of Sienna's tent. The sounds of the circus waking filled the air. The distant rumble of the elephants being led to their paddock, the rhythmic clang of pots from the mess tent, and the murmur of voices as performers greeted the day. But Sienna remained still, her gaze fixed on the small crack in the roof that revealed a sliver of the sky. Last night had left her restless. Julian's words lingered in her mind like the echo of a forgotten melody, pulling at something deep within her. Not everything is as far as it seems. What had he meant by that? She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. She couldn't afford to get distracted, not with another performance looming that evening. A sharp knock on the wooden post outside her tent broke her reverie. "Sienna? You awake?" It was Clara, her voice brisk as always. Sienna sat up and stretched, her muscles sore from the previous night's performance. "Come in," she called, rubbing her eyes. Clara stepped inside. A clipboard tucked under one arm and a bundle of fabric draped over the other. "Costume check for tonight," she said, laying the fabric on the edge of Sienna's cot. It was a new leotard, the fabric shimmering like liquid gold. "It's beautiful," Sienna said, running her fingers over the delicate stitching. "And delicate," Clara warned. "Don't let it catch on anything. Now, there's something else. The ringmaster wants to see you in his office." Sienna's stomach tightened. The ringmaster's summons were rarely good news. Did he say why? Clara shook her head. "Just go, and take that with you." She gestured to the golden leotard before slipping out of the tent. Sienna dressed quickly, her mind racing with possibilities as she made her way to the ringmaster's office. The small wooden structure stood apart from the rest of the tents, its painted facade peeling in places. She knocked twice before the door creaked open. "Come in," the ringmaster's voice boomed. She stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the cluttered space. Papers and ledgers were stacked in precarious piles, and the air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke. The ringmaster sat behind his desk, his imposing frame filling the space. His piercing eyes fixed on her, and she resisted the urge to shrink under his gaze. "Sienna," he began, his tone measured. "You've been doing well. The crowds love you." "Thank you," she said cautiously. "But success comes with expectations," he continued, leaning forward. and I need to be sure you're up to the challenge. Tonight, I want something more. A new routine. Something that will leave them breathless. Sienna's heart sank. A new routine meant hours of practice, riskier maneuvers, and the possibility of failure. I'll do my best, she said, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. Good, the ringmaster said, leaning back with a satisfied smile. I'm counting on you, Sienna. Don't disappoint me. She nodded and left the office, her mind already racing with ideas for a routine. But as she stepped outside, she nearly collided with Julian. He was leaning casually against the side of the building, a mischievous grin on his face. Eavesdropping, she accused, crossing her arms. I prefer to call it being in the right place at the right time, he replied. Sounds like you've got a big night ahead. She sighed, her frustration evident. You have no idea. Maybe I do, he said, his tone softening. What if I could help? Sienna raised an eyebrow. You? Help me? I'm more than just a magician, he said, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite decipher. I know a thing or two about spectacle. Despite her reservations, she found herself intrigued. What do you have in mind? Julian stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Meet me after rehearsal tonight. There's something I want to show you. Before she could ask more, he turned and walked away, leaving her staring after him. The day passed in a blur of rehearsals and preparations, her thoughts continually drifting to Julian's mysterious offer. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Sienna found herself at the edge of the fairground, waiting. Julian appeared as if out of nowhere, his black coat blending seamlessly with the shadows. He gestured for her to follow, leading her to a small clearing behind the tents. There, beneath the canopy of stars, he revealed an intricate contraption made of ropes and pulleys. What is this? She asked, her curiosity piqued. An idea, he said. Something that will make your routine unforgettable. He spent the next hour explaining his vision, his passion igniting a spark in her own imagination. By the time they finished, Sienna felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. Julian's idea was daring, perhaps even reckless, but it had the potential to be extraordinary. As they parted ways, Julian's parting words lingered in her mind. Trust me, Sienna. Sometimes, you have to take a leap of faith. That night, as she lay in her cot staring at the sliver of sky above, Sienna realized that for the first time in years, she felt something she thought she'd lost: hope. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Spotlight. The anticipation in the air was palpable as the circus grounds came alive with activity. Performers darted between tents, their costumes catching the light of lanterns strung above. The audience's murmurs grew into a steady hum as more people arrived, their excitement infectious. Sienna watched it all from the shadows of her dressing tent, her fingers toying nervously with the golden fabric of her new leotard. The contraption Julian had shown her the previous night was etched in her mind. It was bold, dangerous, and unlike anything she'd ever attempted. Part of her felt reckless for even considering it, but another part, the part that longed for freedom from the monotony of her carefully choreographed routines, was exhilarated. She could almost hear Julian's voice in her head, urging her to take the leap. 5 minutes to curtain, a stagehand called, poking his head into the tent. Sienna's heart raced. She had spent the day rehearsing the basics of Julian's plan, but the full execution would happen tonight, live, with no margin for error. Her thoughts were interrupted by Clara bustling in, her ever-present clipboard in hand. You ready? Clara asked, her sharp gaze softening slightly as she took in Sienna's tense expression. As ready as I'll ever be, Sienna replied, forcing a smile. Clara hesitated, then placed a hand on Sienna's shoulder. You're going to be amazing. You always are. Just remember why you're up there." Sienna nodded, though the question lingered in her mind. Why was she up there? To dazzle the crowd? To please the ringmaster? Or was it something deeper? A yearning to reclaim a piece of herself? The booming voice of the ringmaster cut through her thoughts, announcing the start of the night's performance. Sienna took a deep breath and stepped out into the cool night air, the cheers of the crowd washing over her like a wave. Backstage, Julian was waiting. He leaned against a wooden post, his expression unreadable in the dim light. When he saw her, he straightened and gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You've got this," he said softly. "Trust yourself." Sienna didn't respond, but his words steadied her nerves. She climbed the ladder to the trapeze platform, her hands gripping the rungs tightly. Below, the crowd's faces blurred together into a sea of expectant eyes. The lights dimmed, and the music swelled, signaling her entrance. She began with her usual routine, the familiar movements easing her into a rhythm. The audience gasped and cheered as she performed daring flips and twists, her body moving with practiced precision. But all the while, her mind was on the next phase, the leap of faith Julian had designed. As she swung to the platform, she caught sight of him below, standing near the ropes that controlled the contraption. Their eyes met, and he gave her a barely perceptible nod. It was time. Sienna steadied herself, her heart pounding. She reached for the release mechanism on her trapeze bar, her fingers trembling. With a deep breath, she let go. For a split second, she was weightless, the world around her falling away. Then the ropes caught, and she was propelled upward, soaring higher than she'd ever been. Gasps erupted from the crowd as she executed a mid-air twist, her body spinning like a golden comet. The contraption worked seamlessly, the pulleys and ropes guiding her through a series of breathtaking maneuvers. The final move was the most daring. Sienna arched her body and reached for the second trapeze bar, which Julian had positioned at an impossible height. The crowd held its collective breath as she stretched, her fingers grazing the bar. For a terrifying moment, it seemed she might miss. But then her grip held firm, and she swung gracefully to the other side, landing on the platform with a flourish. The audience erupted into applause, the sound deafening. Sienna's chest heaved as she caught her breath, a triumphant smile breaking across her face. She looked down to where Julian stood, his face lit with a mixture of pride and relief. He raised his hand in a subtle gesture of applause, and she nodded in acknowledgement. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Performers and stagehands alike crowded around her, offering congratulations and slaps on the back. Clara appeared, her clipboard forgotten as she hugged Sienna tightly. "That was incredible," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anything like it." Julian appeared at the edge of the crowd, his presence commanding yet unobtrusive. He waited until the others had dispersed before approaching Sienna. "Well?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Sienna laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place she hadn't known was still alive. "You were right. It was worth it." He smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that softened his usually enigmatic features. "I knew you could do it." As the night wore on, Sienna found herself replaying the performance in her mind. For the first time in years, she felt more than just a performer going through the motions. She felt alive, as if she'd rediscovered a part of herself she'd thought lost forever. And as she lay in her cot that night, staring at the painted sky of the circus tent, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something extraordinary. Chapter 5. Falling Under the Spell. The following morning dawned with the faint warmth of sunlight filtering through the canvas of the circus tents. Sienna awoke to the muffled sounds of the camp stirring to life. The clang of pots from the kitchen tent, the rumble of wagons being moved, and the distant laughter of children chasing each other among the caravans. The performance from the previous night lingered in her mind, a swirl of adrenaline and triumph that had kept her awake long after the crowd dispersed. Pulling on her boots, she made her way to the edge of the grounds where the performers often gathered for breakfast. Clara, ever organized, was already orchestrating the morning routine, clipboard in hand. Sienna grabbed a piece of bread and a mug of steaming tea, sitting down on a crate as her fellow performers chatted around her. Despite the lively atmosphere, her gaze wandered, searching for one person in particular. It didn't take long to find him. Julian was seated beneath the shade of a large oak tree, sketching intently in a leather-bound notebook. His dark hair was tousled, and he seemed unaware of the world around him, entirely absorbed in whatever he was drawing. Sienna hesitated, debating whether to approach him. Their collaboration on the trapeze act had created a bond, but she couldn't deny the aura of mystery that surrounded him. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the grassy clearing and stopped a few steps away. "Do you always work this hard in the morning?" she asked, her voice light. Julian looked up, startled for a moment before his lips curved into a small smile. "Inspiration doesn't keep office hours," he replied, closing the notebook. "How are you feeling after last night?" "Still riding the high," Sienna admitted, sitting down beside him. "I've never done anything like that before. It was terrifying, but also liberating. That's the magic of taking risks," Julian said. He glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "You proved something to yourself up there. It's not just about the audience." Sienna nodded, realizing he was right. For years, her performances had been carefully choreographed, designed to please others. Last night had been different. It had been for her. "What about you?" she asked, gesturing to his notebook. "What are you working on?" Julian hesitated, his expression guarded. Then, with a sigh, he opened the notebook to reveal a series of intricate sketches. Some depicted mechanical designs, gears, levers, and ropes, while others were more abstract, showing swirling patterns and faintly human figures. Sienna studied them, captivated. "These are incredible," she said, running her fingers lightly over the page. "Are they for the circus?" "Some of them," Julian admitted. "Others are just ideas, concepts I've been playing with." "You're an artist," Sienna said, impressed. "A tinkerer," Julian corrected, though his tone held a hint of pride. "I've always been fascinated by how things work, how they move, how they fit together. It's like solving a puzzle." Sienna looked at him, seeing him in a new light. There was more to Julian than the enigmatic magician she'd initially pegged him as. He was a creator, driven by curiosity and imagination. "Have you ever thought about doing more with these?" she asked. "Beyond the circus, I mean." Julian's smile faded slightly, and he closed the notebook. "Not really," he said, his tone clipped. "The circus is my home. It's all I need." The sudden shift in his demeanor took Sienna by surprise. She wanted to press further, but sensed it was a sensitive topic. Instead, she changed the subject. "Do you have plans for tonight's show?" she asked. Julian's smile returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Always," he said, "but you'll have to wait and see." As the day wore on, Sienna found herself drawn to the workshop tent where Julian spent much of his time. She peered inside, her curiosity getting the better of her. The space was cluttered but organized in a way that made sense only to him. Shelves were lined with jars of tiny gears, coils of wire, and an array of tools. In the center of the room stood an unfinished contraption, its purpose unclear but intriguing. Julian appeared moments later, carrying a crate of supplies. He raised an eyebrow at her, but didn't seem annoyed by her presence. "Can't stay away, can you?" he teased, setting the crate down. "You've piqued my curiosity," Sienna admitted. "What is all this?" Pieces of ideas, Julian said, gesturing around the room. Some will become acts. Others will stay as sketches in a notebook.
It depends.
Sienna stepped closer to the contraption, studying its intricate design. Can I help? Julian looked at her, surprised. Then he nodded. Sure, but don't say I didn't warn you. It's not as glamorous as flying through the air. The hours slipped by as they worked side by side, assembling pieces and testing mechanisms. Sienna found herself laughing more than she had in months, Julian's dry humor and quick wit keeping her entertained. By the time they stepped out of the tent, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Sienna looked at Julian, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie. He caught her gaze and smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that made her heart skip a beat. Thanks for the help, he said. You're not bad with tools. Maybe I missed my calling, Sienna replied, her tone playful. Julian chuckled, but his expression grew serious. You're more than just a performer, Sienna. You have a spark. Don't let anyone dim it. His words lingered in her mind as she made her way back to her tent, the painted sky above her a reminder of the possibilities that lay ahead. Chapter 6. A Heart Suspended in Midair. The circus grounds transformed as night fell, lit by strings of flickering bulbs that cast a warm, golden glow over the camp. The distant hum of the crowd assembling under the big top created an electric undercurrent, a sign of the evening's anticipation. Sienna stood near the performer's tent, adjusting the straps of her costume. Her heart fluttered with nerves, but her mind was elsewhere, on the lingering echo of Julian's words from earlier in the day. You're more than just a performer, Sienna. You have a spark. Don't let anyone dim it. What had he meant by that? The compliment had been simple, yet it carried weight, as if Julian saw through her practiced confidence to something deeper, something she wasn't ready to confront. Ready for another night of magic? Clara's voice broke through her thoughts. The ringmaster's presence was as commanding as ever, her tailored crimson coat gleaming under the lights. Always, Sienna replied, forcing a smile. Clara's eyes narrowed, but she didn't pry. Good. Tonight's crowd is big, and they'll expect nothing less than perfection. Don't let me down. With a nod, Sienna headed toward the main tent, where the air buzzed with energy. She passed the clowns practicing their slapstick routines and the acrobats stretching their limber bodies. As she approached the trapeze rigging, she spotted Julian at the edge of the performance area. He was speaking with his stagehand, his hands gesturing animatedly as he explained something. The sight of him, so immersed in his work, brought an unbidden smile to her lips. Before she could stop herself, Sienna walked over. Is this another one of your surprises? She asked, tilting her head toward the stage. Julian looked up, his expression softening. You'll see soon enough, he replied cryptically. You and your secrets, she said, crossing her arms. Do you ever let anyone in? For a moment, Julian's playful demeanor faded. His eyes darkened, and his voice grew quiet. Some doors are better left closed. The weight of his words hung between them, and Sienna felt a pang of regret for pushing. But before she could respond, the drum roll of the opening act signaled the start of the show. Julian gave her a quick nod and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The trapeze act was flawless. Sienna flew through the air with a grace that felt instinctive, her body responding to the rhythm of the music and the gasps of the audience. Yet, even as she performed, her mind kept returning to Julian. There was something about him that drew her in, a mix of charm and secrecy that was impossible to ignore. After the show, the performers gathered around the fire pit, as was their nightly tradition. Laughter and chatter filled the air, but Sienna's attention was elsewhere. She scanned the group, searching for Julian, but he was nowhere to be found. Looking for someone? A voice asked. It was Victor, one of the acrobats, His sharp features were softened by the firelight, and his knowing smile made Sienna's cheeks flush. "Just enjoying the night," she said, brushing off his question. Victor chuckled. "Careful with that one," he said, his tone teasing but with an undercurrent of warning. "Julian doesn't play by the same rules as the rest of us." "What do you mean?" Sienna asked, her curiosity piqued. Victor shrugged. "He's a mystery. Always has been. Just don't get too close, or you might find yourself caught in one of his illusions." Sienna frowned, unsure what to make of Victor's words. Was it jealousy, or was there truth in his caution? Either way, she couldn't shake the feeling that Julian was hiding something important. Later that night, unable to sleep, Sienna found herself wandering the circus grounds. The tents loomed like silent sentinels under the moonlight, their vibrant colors muted by the pale glow. She followed the faint sound of music, a haunting melody that seemed to beckon her. The tune led her to the workshop tent. She peeked inside and found Julian sitting at a workbench, his back to her. The room was illuminated by the soft light of an oil lamp, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He was playing a violin, the bow gliding across the strings with a skill that took her breath away. "I didn't know you played," she said, stepping inside. Julian turned, startled. The music stopped abruptly, and he set the violin down. "It's not something I share often," he said, his voice guarded. "Why not?" "You're incredible," Sienna said, genuinely impressed. Julian hesitated, his fingers brushing the strings of the violin. "Music is personal. It's one of the few things that's truly mine." Sienna nodded, understanding more than he realized. "You don't have to hide it. Sometimes sharing what's personal can make it even more meaningful." Julian's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the walls he kept so carefully constructed seemed to crumble. "Maybe," he said softly. They sat in companionable silence, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger. For the first time, Sienna felt like she was beginning to glimpse the real Julian, the man behind the magician's mask, and as the night stretched on, she realized that the shadows he carried might not be so different from her own. Chapter 7. Behind the velvet curtain. The following morning, the sun crept over the horizon, painting the circus grounds in soft hues of gold and lavender. The dew sparkled on the grass, and the air carried a cool, crisp promise of a new day. Sienna emerged from her wagon, a steaming cup of tea in hand, and took in the serene beauty around her. Yet, her mind was far from calm. The memory of her late-night encounter with Julian lingered, and the vulnerability he'd shown had only deepened her curiosity about him. The tranquility of the moment was interrupted by the clamor of the circus coming to life. Performers bustled about, preparing for the day ahead. Sienna's routine was usually straightforward: practice, perform, repeat. But today, she felt a strange pull to explore beyond the confines of her usual path. She decided to seek out Julian, her questions about him multiplying with each passing moment. She found him near the storage tent, his sleeves rolled up as he examined a set of props. His focus was intense, and he didn't seem to notice her approach until she was a few feet away. "Good morning," she said, her voice tentative. Julian looked up, his expression softening. "Morning, Sienna. You're up early." "So are you," she replied, gesturing to the props. "Planning something new?" He chuckled. "Always. The audience expects to be surprised, and I aim to deliver." Sienna hesitated, then decided to press on. "About last night," Julian's demeanor shifted subtly, his posture tensing. "What about it?" "The music," she said, choosing her words carefully. "It was beautiful. You don't have to keep it hidden." For a moment, Julian said nothing. He set down the prop in his hand and met her gaze. "There are things in my life that are better left hidden, Sienna. The violin is just a piece of it." "But why?" she asked, unable to mask the frustration in her voice. Why keep parts of yourself locked away? Julian's eyes darkened, and when he spoke, his voice was low. Because not everything about me would fit neatly into this world. People come to the circus to escape, to believe in something magical. They don't want to see what's real. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sienna's chest tightened. She wanted to understand him, to unravel the mystery he carried. But she could see that pushing him too far would only drive him away. If you ever want to talk about it, she said softly, I'm here. Julian's expression softened, and he gave her a faint smile. Thank you, Sienna. That means more than you know. As the day wore on, Sienna threw herself into her practice, hoping the familiar rhythm of her routine would quiet her restless mind. But even as she soared through the air on the trapeze, her thoughts kept drifting back to Julian. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. That evening, the circus's performance drew an even larger crowd than usual. The tent was packed, the air charged with excitement. Sienna's act was set to close the show, and she waited backstage, watching the other performers dazzle the audience. Julian's act came just before hers, and she found herself captivated by his performance. He stepped onto the stage in a swirl of smoke and light, his commanding presence holding the audience spellbound. His illusions were seamless, his movements precise. But what struck Sienna most was the look in his eyes. There was a raw intensity there, a vulnerability that seemed to seep through the cracks of his polished facade. She wondered if anyone else could see it. When it was her turn, Sienna took the stage with renewed determination. She executed her routine flawlessly, her movements imbued with an energy she hadn't felt in weeks. The crowd erupted into applause as she landed her final leap, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly alive. After the show, the performers gathered for their usual post-performance celebration. Laughter and music filled the air, but Sienna couldn't shake the feeling that Julian was avoiding her. She finally spotted him on the outskirts of the group, leaning against a wagon with a distant look in his eyes. You were amazing tonight, she said as she approached him. Julian glanced at her, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. So were you. The crowd loved it. That's not what I mean, she said, stepping closer. You put so much of yourself into your performance. It's like you're telling a story, but I'm not sure anyone knows what it is. Julian's smile faded, and he looked away. Maybe some stories are better left untold, or maybe they're the ones that need to be shared the most, Sienna countered, her voice gentle. For a moment, Julian said nothing. Then, he sighed and turned to face her. You're relentless. You know that? Sienna smiled. I've been told. Julian's gaze softened, and he seemed to wrestle with himself before finally speaking. There are things about my past, things I'm not proud of. The circus gave me a chance to start over, to be someone else. But sometimes, the shadows of who I was creep in. Sienna's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. You don't have to be defined by your past, Julian. You can choose who you want to be. He studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he let out a soft laugh. You're something else, Sienna. I'll take that as a compliment, she said with a grin. As the night deepened, they stood together under the stars, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger. For the first time, Julian seemed to let his guard down, and Sienna felt a flicker of hope that he might finally let her in. Chapter 8. Whispers Beneath the Big Top. The night air was cool, the kind of crisp chill that sank into the bones and made the stars appear sharper, brighter. The circus tents, now draped in the heavy shadows of evening, loomed over the quiet grounds, as if holding their breath for the show to come. The scent of sawdust mixed with the earthy tang of grass beneath Sienna's feet, and the faint hum of excitement rippled through the camp, barely perceptible. The circus was always alive with the buzz of anticipation before the performance, but tonight, there was an unsettling stillness in the air, a sense of something unknown gathering just beyond the horizon. Sienna stood on the edge of the performers' camp, her gaze fixed on the empty space where the trapeze rig would soon rise, towering like a skeletal monument. She could almost hear the swing of the ropes in the wind, the familiar creak of the wooden bar. It was a sound that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember, the one that had given rhythm to her heartbeat. But tonight, the sound felt distant. She wrapped her arms around herself, her fingers brushing over the soft fabric of the old jacket Julian had given her. It was too big, too warm for the season, but she wore it anyway, needing its familiarity, its comfort. It smelled faintly of him, a mix of leather and something more, something intangible that she couldn't quite place. Her thoughts drifted back to him, to Julian, and the look in his eyes when they'd spoken that afternoon, the way he had hesitated before speaking, his words heavy with a weight that had pressed down on her chest, even though he had said so little. "I know something is wrong," he had murmured, his fingers brushing her cheek, sending a jolt of warmth through her. She hadn't known how to respond. How could she explain what she was feeling, when even she couldn't fully understand it? It was as though a storm was gathering inside her, a storm she had no control over, no way to stop. She felt like she was spinning faster with each passing day, caught in the chaos of the circus, of the people around her, of Julian's steady presence and the pull he had on her heart. But still, there was the fear that she couldn't escape, that everything she was running from would finally catch up with her, would break the fragile peace she had built within the safety of the circus walls. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, soft but certain, and Sienna turned, her eyes searching the shadows for the source. It wasn't hard to spot him, Julian, his figure cutting through the darkness like a shadow made flesh. He was dressed in his usual performance clothes, the black and silver accents gleaming in the faint light of the moon. His face, usually so composed, was etched with the same tension that had marked his every movement since they'd arrived in this new town. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, watching her with those piercing eyes that seemed to see through every mask she wore. "You're quiet tonight," he said at last, his voice low, careful. "You've been quiet for days now." Sienna took a slow breath, her throat tightening as she met his gaze. "I don't know what's happening to me," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I feel lost." Julian stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them, his hand reaching out to touch her arm gently, his fingers warm against her cold skin. "I don't know what you're running from, Sienna," he said, his voice soft, almost tender, "but I'm not going anywhere. Whatever it is, I'll face it with you." She shook her head, the words too tangled in her chest to give voice to. There was so much more to say, so much more to explain, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. The truth of her past, the secrets she carried like stones in her pockets, she couldn't share them, not yet, not with him. "I'm not running," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Julian's hand dropped to his side, and he looked away for a moment, as though wrestling with something inside himself. Then, his gaze returned to her, steady and unwavering. "You don't have to run anymore," he said. "Not with me." Her heart skipped a beat, the warmth of his words sinking deep into her chest. She wanted so badly to believe him, to trust him with everything. But there was still that nagging fear, that little voice in the back of her mind that told her she was destined to ruin everything she touched. Julian's lips curled into a soft smile, a smile that was both reassuring and wistful, as though he could see the struggle inside her, the war between what she wanted and what she feared. "I'm not asking for anything, Sienna," he said quietly. "I just want you to be here, with me, as you are." She swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with the force of everything unsaid between them. For a moment, they stood there in the quiet, the weight of the night pressing down on them, the air thick with unspoken words. Then, with a soft exhale, Julian reached for her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture so simple, so natural, it made Sienna's breath catch. He pulled her gently toward the tent, toward the ring, where the rest of the performers were preparing for the evening's show. "Come on," he said, his voice light, but with an edge of something deeper, something that made Sienna's pulse quicken. "The night's waiting." Sienna nodded, her heart thundering in her chest. The performance was about to begin, but more than that, the journey they were on, together, was only just beginning. And in that moment, beneath the painted sky of the circus tents, Sienna allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for her here. A place where she didn't have to run, where she could finally stop being afraid. Chapter 9. A Dance of Flames and Mirrors. The morning after the performance, the circus grounds were quiet, as if the world itself had fallen asleep, exhausted from the previous night's magic. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the remnants of fog curling lazily around the tent poles and fading into the rising sun. The clamor of the previous night's laughter and applause seemed like a distant memory now, swallowed by the stillness of the early hours. Sienna stood by the edge of the camp, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped mug, its once bright colors now muted by the passage of time. The sun was barely touching the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the sprawling circus grounds. She had never been one for mornings, but today, there was something about the quiet, the empty space between the past and the future, that felt peaceful. She had spent the night alone, as she always did after a show, retreating to her small caravan to gather her thoughts, to try and understand what had transpired between her and Julian. The performance had gone flawlessly, as it always did, but something had changed in the air. The connection between them was undeniable now, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Not when he had looked at her the way he had, his eyes filled with something deeper than just admiration. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze dance through her hair, and tried to calm the whirlwind of emotions inside her. It was easier to lose herself in the rhythm of the trapeze, the familiar swing of the ropes, the rush of air as she soared above the crowd. But now, with Julian's presence hanging over her, it was harder to escape. And part of her didn't want to. The sound of footsteps broke her from her thoughts, and she turned to find Julian approaching, his figure emerging from the shadows of the tents. He was dressed simply, his usual dark clothing replaced by a loose shirt and trousers, his jacket slung carelessly over his shoulder. His hair was still damp from the morning dew, and his face, though still guarded, was softer somehow, like the weight of the previous night's unspoken words had lifted just a little. "You're up early," Sienna remarked, her voice softer than she intended. "I could say the same for you," Julian replied with a grin, but there was an underlying tension in his voice, the hint of something unsaid. He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching her face with the intensity of someone trying to decode a riddle. Sienna bit her lip, unable to hold his gaze for long. There was a quiet pressure between them now, a space filled with the echoes of their shared moment the night before. She wasn't sure what to say, or how to bridge the gap that still existed between them. The fear she had buried so deep inside her, the fear of letting someone in, of letting herself feel, was rising again, clawing at the edges of her mind. "Do you ever wonder?" she began slowly, her voice almost lost in the morning haze. "If we're running out of time?" Julian's brow furrowed, and for a moment, he said nothing. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch hers, his fingers warm against her cool skin. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice gentle. Sienna drew in a shaky breath, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I mean this. Us. It feels like we're standing on the edge of something, but I don't know what it is. I don't know if I'm ready to jump. Julian's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing over his face. I don't expect you to have all the answers, Sienna, he said quietly, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. She pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself in a protective gesture, as if to shield herself from the vulnerability that was starting to break through. But what if we're just fooling ourselves? She whispered. What if all of this is just a distraction from something we can't escape? Julian's gaze never wavered, his eyes steady, unblinking. Sometimes, the things we're afraid of are the very things we need to face, he said. I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now. I'm not asking you to change overnight, but I want to be here, with you, through it all. Whatever comes. The sincerity in his voice struck her like a physical blow, the weight of his words sinking into her chest. She swallowed hard, the tightness in her throat making it difficult to speak. How could he be so certain? How could he believe in something when she was still so lost, so broken? She wanted to tell him everything. The truth about her past, the fear that clung to her like a shadow, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't ready to share that part of herself. Not yet. Instead, she took a step back, her hands trembling as she clutched the mug tightly. I don't know if I can do this, Julian, she whispered, more to herself than to him. For a moment, Julian said nothing, just watching her with a quiet intensity that made her skin flush with the weight of his gaze. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he took a deep breath and stepped closer, his presence surrounding her like a force she couldn't escape. You don't have to do it alone, he said, his voice low but filled with an unwavering certainty. I'm here, Sienna, and I'm not going anywhere. The silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating, but somehow comforting. Sienna closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket, offering a warmth she hadn't known she needed. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face everything alone. She didn't have to run anymore. Chapter 10. The Illusion of Freedom. The day after their conversation, the circus was buzzing with the usual routine. Yet a strange stillness lingered between Sienna and Julian, like the calm before a storm. There was no denying the tension, the unspoken words that hung in the air every time their eyes met, every time their hands brushed against each other. It was as though the invisible thread that had always connected them had grown taut, ready to snap at any moment. Yet, neither of them could bring themselves to address it, to confront what had passed between them the night before. Sienna found herself retreating to the high wire that afternoon, needing the solitude of the rig, the height, the isolation. It was the one place where she felt truly herself, where her mind could quieten, where the world below seemed distant and far removed. Her fingers tightened around the ropes, her feet positioning themselves with the precision of countless rehearsals, her body moving fluidly between the silken strands that held her suspended above the earth. She breathed deeply, the wind carrying the scent of the nearby trees and the faint echo of laughter from below. But even in this high, silent place, she couldn't escape the thoughts swirling in her mind. It had been years since she truly allowed herself to feel anything, to allow anyone close enough to break down the walls she built around her heart. Her past was a tangled mess of regret and sorrow, a history of loss that she had never been able to let go of. She had trained herself to ignore it, to bury it deep down beneath the surface, where no one could touch it. But now, with Julian, the walls were starting to crack, the past creeping back in, demanding to be acknowledged. The trapeze bar swung beneath her, and Sienna's eyes focused on the distance ahead. Her heart beat a little faster, but not from the adrenaline of the act. This was different. The quiet thrum of her pulse had nothing to do with the performance, and everything to do with the weight of what she had hidden for so long. "You're not running anymore," Julian's words echoed in her mind, and she clung to them, even as they stirred a storm within her. Could she really stop running? Could she let him in? Let him see the parts of her that she had so carefully hidden from everyone? The fear was suffocating. The sound of footsteps beneath her, then the familiar voice calling her name, brought her back to the present. "Sienna." She turned, her heart jumping in her chest as Julian's figure emerged from the shadows of the circus tents below. He was standing by the base of the rig, looking up at her with an expression that was equal parts concern and something deeper, something more uncertain. His brow was furrowed, his jaw set in that familiar, tense line that made her wonder just how much he had picked up on in the days since their conversation. "I didn't want to interrupt," he said, his voice carrying up to her. "But I thought you might be up here." Sienna took a deep breath and steadied herself. She could feel the tightness in her chest, the familiar knot of anxiety that always formed whenever he was near, whenever he was so close to seeing her for who she really was. She had always kept her distance, always kept her secrets, and now, standing above him, her heart pounded in a way that made it impossible to ignore the truth any longer. She didn't answer immediately, just watched him for a long moment, her fingers still gripping the ropes tightly as if they were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. "I didn't know if I should come up," he continued, his voice quieter now. "But you've been distant the last few days, and I thought—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. Sienna's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a pang of guilt. He was trying, and she wasn't. The realization stung more than she expected. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice hoarse. "I've been running in my own way. I'm just not sure how to stop." The words felt foreign coming out of her mouth, but it was true. She had been running her whole life, from the pain of losing her family, from the guilt she carried, from the fear that love would only bring more heartache. She had built the walls so high, so thick, that she didn't know how to tear them down, not even for him. "You don't have to stop running," Julian replied, his voice steady but warm. "Not if you're not ready. I just want you to know that I'm here, Sienna. I'm not going anywhere." His words, simple as they were, did something to her, something she hadn't expected. They brought a warmth to the cold, bitter places inside her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone in the darkness. Sienna slid down the ropes to the platform, her movements fluid and graceful, her feet touching the ground lightly. She stood in front of him, close enough now to feel the heat of his body, close enough to feel the weight of his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fade, the sounds of the circus far away, as though they were the only two people in existence. "I've always been afraid," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Afraid that if I let someone in, I'd lose them. I've lost so much already. I don't know if I can survive losing more." Julian reached for her, his hand gentle against her cheek, his touch sending a tremor through her that she couldn't ignore. "You don't have to be afraid of that," he said softly. "Not with me." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the warmth of his hand against her skin, the safety in his presence. She didn't know what the future held, or if she was ready to let go of the past, but in that moment, she realized she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. Chapter 11. Shattered Reflections. The circus was quieter than usual, the usual hum of activity subdued, as if the entire camp was holding its breath. It had been days since Sienna had allowed herself to take the first step toward breaking down the walls she had built around her heart. Each day, she had ventured a little farther out of her shell, allowing Julian closer, allowing herself to feel the stirrings of something more. But despite the progress, there was still something in the air. An unspoken tension, a weight that hung over them both. Today, the sky above was a vast, pale blue canvas, unmarred by clouds, and the sun blazed down, casting sharp shadows on the ground. Sienna walked along the edge of the circus grounds, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of Julian and the promise she had made to herself the day before. To stop running, to stop hiding from him, from the truth. But the truth was a difficult thing to face, and it had always been easier for her to keep her emotions buried, to keep the past locked away in the deepest corners of her mind. After all, if she didn't confront it, it couldn't hurt her. Or so she had told herself. She stopped by one of the tents, her gaze drifting over the colorful fabric that billowed in the breeze. The laughter and chatter of the performers and crew filled the air, but Sienna felt an unsettling distance from them all. Her thoughts were still tethered to the conversation she and Julian had shared on the high wire, to the vulnerability she had revealed without even realizing it. Her heart still ached with the admission that she had been running her whole life, hiding from the very thing she longed for. Connection, love, acceptance. But was she ready to truly face that? Could she allow herself to let go of the fear, to step into the unknown and embrace something that could break her all over again? Sienna. Her name broke through the haze of her thoughts, and she turned to find Julian standing a few paces away, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. His expression was unreadable, and for a moment, it was as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them, the air thick with anticipation. "I've been looking for you," Julian said, his voice low, but steady. There was a hint of urgency in his words, something that made Sienna's chest tighten. "There's something we need to talk about." Sienna's stomach clenched, and she took a small step back. She had sensed that something was coming, but she hadn't expected it to be today, hadn't expected the weight of it to hit her so suddenly. Her instincts told her to run, to retreat into herself, but something, maybe the bond between them, maybe the truth that had begun to form in her heart, made her stay. "What is it?" she asked, her voice quiet, though her heart was pounding in her chest. Julian took a deep breath, his eyes locking with hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The circus around them seemed to fade, the sounds of laughter and activity receding into the background. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to speak, for him to reveal whatever it was that had been weighing so heavily on his heart. "I can't keep this from you anymore," Julian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you need to know. About me." Sienna's pulse quickened, her mind racing with possibilities, none of which she could have predicted. She had expected him to tell her that he cared for her, that he wanted more than what they had. But this was different. She could feel the gravity of his words, the weight of the confession he was about to make. "I've been hiding something," Julian continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "Something that's been with me for a long time. Something that might change everything." Sienna's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively took a step forward, as if drawn to him by an invisible force. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes now, the same kind of fear that she had felt when she had first opened up to him. And yet, he was still standing there, still speaking the truth, even when it was so difficult. "What is it, Julian?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She didn't know what to expect, but she felt a deep sense of dread settle over her, as if whatever he was about to say would shatter everything they had built together. Julian exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. When he looked up again, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something dark, something painful. "I'm not just a magician, Sienna," he said, his voice strained. "There's more to me than you know." I'm not who you think I am. Sienna's mind spun with confusion, and she frowned, unsure of where this was going. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian hesitated for a moment, and then, with a deep breath, he finally spoke the truth that had been haunting him for years. I'm not just a performer. I'm running from something too. From a past I can't escape. Her heart skipped a beat, and she reached out instinctively, her hand touching his arm in an attempt to steady herself. What do you mean? What are you running from? Julian's eyes flickered with something like pain, but he didn't pull away. I come from a family of illusionists, but we've always been more than that. My family. We're part of something bigger, something dangerous, something I had to leave behind in order to protect myself and everyone I care about. Sienna's mind raced. She had heard rumors of people with connections to secret societies, of powerful families who controlled more than just the circus, but she hadn't believed any of it. Until now. Dangerous? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? What kind of danger? Julian ran a hand through his hair, his expression haunted. My family is involved in things that I can't even explain. Things that would put us all at risk if anyone found out. That's why I left. That's why I came here. To disappear, to escape. But now, it feels like the past is catching up to me. Sienna felt a chill run down her spine, her mind struggling to process what Julian had just revealed. The man she had grown close to, the one she had started to trust, was hiding a past so dark, so dangerous, that it could destroy everything they had built together. Her heart ached for him, for the pain he must have carried all these years. But at the same time, fear began to creep into her chest. How much of his world was a lie? And how much of her own heart was she willing to risk? Chapter 12. An Oath in the Moonlight. Sienna stood there, her hand still lightly resting on Julian's arm, the weight of his confession pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Her mind was spinning, her heart racing with a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else. Something that felt like betrayal. She had known that Julian was hiding something, but she hadn't expected it to be something so vast, so dangerous. His family, involved in things that could put them all at risk? It was almost too much to comprehend. And yet, the look in his eyes, the pain, the vulnerability, told her that he wasn't lying, that everything he had said was true. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The circus around them continued on, oblivious to the tension between the two performers. The laughter of the children, the shouts of the ringmaster, the clinking of coins, all of it felt so distant now, as if they were no longer part of that world, as if they had entered a different realm entirely, where trust was fragile and secrets were like shadows, lurking just beyond the light. I didn't want you to know, Julian finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost regretful, as if he wished he could take back the words he had just spoken. I didn't want to drag you into this mess, but I couldn't keep lying to you. Sienna's fingers tightened on his arm, and she took a small step back, her heart heavy with the weight of the revelation. She had always known that Julian was different, that there was something more to him than met the eye. But now, the truth was out, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. You're running from your past, she said softly, the words coming out almost like a question. But what happens when your past catches up to you, Julian? What happens to us then? His eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and guilt, but there was also something else there, a deep sorrow, as if he had already resigned himself to the fact that the past was something he could never outrun. I don't know, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I've been trying to escape it for years, but I can feel it closing in on me. And I can't keep you safe from it, Sienna. That's the truth. Sienna's chest tightened, and her throat went dry. The words stung more than she had anticipated, more than she was prepared for. She had always known that love, real love, came with its risks, but she had never imagined that it would come with the threat of danger, with the possibility that everything she had come to care about could be ripped away from her in an instant. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking any louder might shatter the fragile moment between them. Julian reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek in a gesture that was both tender and desperate. "You don't have to do anything," he said, his voice firm but full of uncertainty. "You don't have to make any decisions right now. But I want you to know that I won't run from you. I won't leave you." She closed her eyes at his touch, feeling the warmth of his hand on her skin, the raw emotion in his words. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe him, allowed herself to imagine a world where they could be together without the threat of danger hanging over them. But that world felt so distant now, so out of reach. Sienna pulled away slightly, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that love could conquer all, that they could face whatever came their way as long as they were together. But she couldn't ignore the fear that gnawed at her insides, the fear that Julian's past would eventually destroy everything they had built. "I need time," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I need time to think." Julian's expression softened, and he nodded slowly, as if he had expected her response, as if he had been bracing himself for this moment. "I understand, but I want you to know, Sienna, that I'll wait. I'll wait for as long as it takes." Sienna looked into his eyes, searching for something, anything, that would reassure her that this wasn't just another illusion, another trick that would leave her broken and alone. But all she saw was sincerity, and that made her heart ache all the more. "I don't know if I can be with someone who's running from their past," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can live with the fear that at any moment, everything could change." "I'm not asking you to live in fear," Julian said, his voice low but steady. "I'm asking you to trust me, even if it's just a little bit. I'm asking you to trust that I'm doing everything I can to protect you, but I can't do it alone. I need you with me." The desperation in his voice broke something inside her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to reach out and take his hand, to step into the unknown with him, to face whatever danger lurked in his past. But the walls she had built around her heart were strong, and the fear that had been her constant companion for so long was hard to shake. Sienna took a step back, her eyes never leaving his. "I can't promise you anything," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'll think about it. I'll think about what this all means. For us." Julian nodded again, though it was clear that the words had wounded him more than he cared to admit. He stood there for a long moment, staring at her as if trying to read her soul, to understand the depths of the turmoil that was swirling inside her. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be here," he said, his words laced with both hope and resignation. "Whenever you're ready." Sienna watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the distance, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the choice she had to make. It was a choice between love and fear, between trust and uncertainty, and for the first time, she wasn't sure which path to take. Chapter 13. Storm over the tinted sky. The days following their conversation felt like an eternity to Sienna. The circus continued to bustle around her, as vibrant and chaotic as ever, but it seemed like the world had shifted beneath her feet. Each moment with Julian now felt charged with unspoken tension, as if the air between them was thick with the weight of unfulfilled promises and unanswered questions. Sienna spent her days in a fog, going through the motions of her trapeze practice, the routines that had once brought her joy now nothing more than mechanical movements. She felt disconnected, as if she were floating just above the ground, never fully present in any moment. Every time her eyes met Julian's, A rush of conflicting emotions surged through her: love, fear, longing, and doubt. The fear was the hardest to bear. It had become a constant companion, like a shadow lurking just out of reach, waiting to swallow her whole. She had tried to push it aside, to pretend that it wasn't there, but it clung to her, seeping into her thoughts, her dreams, her waking moments. What if Julian's past caught up to them? What if his family, whatever dangerous connections they had, reached out and tore apart the life they had built? And yet, even in the face of that fear, there was something else, a deep yearning, a longing for the connection she had with him, for the warmth of his touch, the tenderness in his eyes. It was that pull that had kept her from running, from cutting him off completely. She had to face this, whatever it was, or risk losing everything she had come to care about. But how could she face it when she was so unsure of herself, of what she truly wanted? She had spent so long running from the truth of her own heart. Could she really face the truth of Julian's past? Could she open herself up to the danger he carried with him? Sienna knew that she couldn't keep living in this limbo. She had to make a choice, but the decision felt like an impossible one. Every night, she lay awake, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and desire, and every morning, she would wake to the same cold uncertainty. It was on one of those mornings, as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring out at the rising sun, that she made a decision. She couldn't keep hiding. She couldn't keep pretending that she wasn't afraid. But she also couldn't keep pretending that she didn't care for him, that the bond between them wasn't something worth fighting for. She had to talk to him, to face the truth of what was happening between them. Whatever came after that, she would deal with. But she couldn't continue to live in this constant state of fear. It wasn't long before Sienna found herself at the edge of the circus grounds, her heart racing as she searched for Julian. The sounds of the morning hustle, barkers calling out to the crowds, the ringmaster organizing his crew, faded into the background as her footsteps echoed against the dusty earth. She knew exactly where he would be. The caravan he called home was at the far end of the lot, tucked away behind a row of tents. Sienna's breath caught in her throat as she approached, her hand hovering over the door to his small, weathered trailer. For a moment, she hesitated. The doubts that had plagued her over the past days surged to the forefront of her mind. What if she was making a mistake? What if confronting the truth was more dangerous than she could ever imagine? But then, the memory of his touch, the sincerity in his eyes, pushed those thoughts aside. She couldn't turn away from this. Not now. Not when she knew, deep down, that they were meant to face this together. With a deep breath, she knocked on the door. The sound of footsteps echoed from inside, and the door creaked open. Julian stood there, looking surprised, yet relieved to see her. His dark eyes softened as he took in her presence, but there was still a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, as if he wasn't sure if he should hope for something more or brace himself for the possibility that she might walk away. "Sienna," he said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't expect to see you. I couldn't stay away," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "We need to talk." Julian stepped aside, allowing her to enter. His small caravan was cramped but cozy, with the faint smell of incense in the air and the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the dusty windows. It was a place that had always seemed like an escape, a refuge from the world. But now, it felt like a space that might hold the answers she needed. They both stood in the center of the room for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but Sienna raised a hand, silencing him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside her. "And I don't know what the right thing to do is. I don't know if I'm strong enough to face the danger that might come with being with you. I don't know if I'm brave enough to confront your past. But I do know one thing." Julian's eyes flickered with something like hope. but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "I'm tired of running," Sienna said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I'm tired of hiding from the truth, and I'm tired of pretending that I don't care. Because I do, Julian. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anything in my life." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over them both. For a long moment, Julian didn't speak. Instead, he took a step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers, as if he were trying to decipher her every thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and almost pleading. "Sienna, are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this? Because once you step into this with me, there's no going back. My past will always be a part of us. There's no way to escape it." "I know," she said softly, meeting his gaze with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "But I'm not asking to escape it. I'm asking to face it. With you." Together. The silence stretched between them, charged with the unspoken weight of their decision. Then, slowly, Julian reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek in a gentle caress. It was a touch full of tenderness, full of promises. Promises of love, of loyalty, of facing whatever came their way. "I'll protect you," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens, I'll protect you." Sienna closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his words. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if they would make it through the storm that was sure to come. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't alone anymore. "I believe you," she whispered back, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that still lingered. And in that moment, with the circus behind them and the world ahead of them, they knew that no matter what dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. Chapter 14. The Grand Escape. The days that followed Sienna's decision felt like a delicate balance between hope and fear, trust and uncertainty. She and Julian had found a new rhythm, an unspoken understanding between them. They no longer tiptoed around each other, no longer let the silence between them stretch out like an insurmountable chasm. There was a quiet strength in their connection now, a sense that no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side. But even as they moved forward together, the weight of the past continued to hover over them like a storm cloud. Julian had made it clear that he would protect her from the dangers his family's past could bring. But Sienna knew that promises could only go so far. There were forces at work beyond his control, forces that had no regard for love, for the fragile bond they had built. The circus continued to move from town to town, its vibrant energy a welcome distraction from the tensions that simmered beneath the surface. Sienna threw herself into her work, her trapeze performances more thrilling than ever, the crowd's applause ringing in her ears like a distant echo of her former self. She had once found solace in the rush of the air beneath her, the freedom of flight. But now, even the thrill of the trapeze couldn't silence the doubts that clung to her like a shadow. She found herself waking in the middle of the night, her thoughts a jumble of questions and fears. Was she truly safe with Julian? Would he be able to protect her from the unknown dangers of his past? Every time she closed her eyes, she could see flashes of the mysterious figures he had alluded to, the people he had been running from, the ones who had threatened the life he had tried to leave behind. And yet, whenever she was with him, all of those fears seemed to fade, if only for a moment. Julian was her anchor, the steady presence that kept her grounded. When he looked at her with that tender, vulnerable gaze, all the questions that had plagued her seemed insignificant. She believed in him. She believed in the connection they shared, the deep bond that had grown between them. But belief, she realized, wasn't always enough. Trust, though vital, wasn't a shield that could protect them from the world outside. One evening, as the circus began to pack up for its next show, Sienna found herself standing at the edge of the grounds, watching the setting sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a scene that had always filled her with awe, but tonight, it seemed different. Tonight, the beauty of the sky felt like a fragile thing, something that could break at any moment. Julian had been distant lately, not in a way that was cold or uncaring, but in a way that suggested there was something on his mind, something he wasn't telling her. She had learned to read him, to understand the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his posture tensed when something troubled him. And right now, he was troubled. She could feel it. As if on cue, she heard his footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. The sound of his approach was familiar now, a comforting presence she had come to rely on. "Sienna," Julian's voice broke through the quiet. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. She turned to face him, searching his expression for any clue as to what was coming. He looked tired, as if the weight of the world had been pressing down on him for far too long. His dark eyes, usually so filled with warmth, were shadowed by something she couldn't quite place. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft, yet full of concern. Julian hesitated for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the horizon, as if seeking the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are things I haven't told you. Things I should have told you earlier." Sienna felt a pang of unease at his words, her instincts telling her that whatever he was about to say would change everything. She stepped closer to him, her heart racing. "What things?" He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for the words that would follow. "My family, they're not just involved in criminal activities. They're powerful, dangerous. And the people who are after me, they don't just want to hurt me. They want to destroy everything I've built." Sienna's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to process his words, but they didn't seem to make sense. She had known that Julian's past was complicated, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "Destroy everything you've built," she repeated, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? What are you saying, Julian?" His gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't noticed before: fear. Real fear. The kind that came from knowing that something far worse was coming. "I mean that the life we've made together, the circus, the people we care about, they're all in danger," Julian said, his voice tight with emotion. "These people, they don't just want me. They'll go after anyone close to me. They'll use anyone they can to get to me." Sienna's mind reeled, her heart racing in her chest. She had known this was coming, but hearing the truth, seeing it laid bare in front of her, was a blow she hadn't been prepared for. The circus, the performers who had become like family to her, were all now caught in the crossfire of Julian's past. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why wait until now?" Julian ran a hand through his hair, frustration and guilt written across his face. "I didn't want to drag you into this. I wanted to keep you safe. But I realize now that I can't protect you from this on my own. I need your help, Sienna. I need you to stand with me." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. Sienna had always known that love came with risks, but she hadn't anticipated this. She hadn't expected that Julian's past would reach out and pull her into the danger he had spent so many years trying to outrun. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her heart ache, a deep vulnerability, a rawness that she hadn't seen before. He wasn't asking her to follow him blindly. He was asking her to choose him, to choose their future, even if it meant facing the dangers that loomed ahead. Sienna took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made a choice once before. She had chosen to be with him, to stand by his side. And now, she had to make that choice again. "I'll stand with you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overtake her. We'll face this together. Julian's eyes softened, gratitude and relief flooding his features. You don't know how much that means to me, he whispered. I promise, I won't let anything happen to you. As Sienna looked at him, she realized that the danger they faced wasn't just about Julian's past. It was about their future. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with threats they couldn't yet understand. But no matter what came, she knew one thing. They would face it together. And in that moment, with the sky stretching above them, a world of possibility and danger lay before them. Chapter 15. A Love Beyond the Curtain Call. The night after their conversation hung heavy in the air, the circus quiet, save for the distant sounds of laughter and music from the performers who remained behind to celebrate a successful show. But Sienna and Julian, alone in the small, dimly lit tent they shared, sat in silence. The weight of Julian's words settled over them like an oppressive fog, too much to fully process, yet undeniable. The danger was real, and their lives, once carefree under the painted sky, had now become intertwined with shadows from Julian's past that neither of them could outrun. Sienna lay awake long after Julian had drifted into an uneasy sleep beside her. She watched him as he slept, his features soft in the moonlight that filtered through the thin fabric of their tent. His breathing was slow and steady, but there was something in the way his muscles twitched, the way his jaw clenched even in slumber, that spoke to the tension still gripping him. She had never seen Julian so vulnerable. The man who had once dazzled her with his charm and mystery now seemed smaller in the face of the unknown. The danger he had feared for so long finally reaching out to him with claws of inevitability. Her heart ached for him, for all that he had endured alone, for all that he was still carrying, things he had kept buried for so long. And yet, she had made her choice. They were in this together now, no turning back. Sienna sat up, her thoughts a whirl of confusion, doubt, and fear. She had never thought of herself as someone who could stand up to danger, let alone face it head-on. But the love she felt for Julian burned brightly, warming her even through the uncertainty that clouded their future. Her gaze flickered toward the flaps of the tent. The circus was alive with activity just outside, but she felt as though she had stepped into a different world entirely, a world where nothing was certain anymore, and every moment felt like the calm before a storm. She looked at Julian again, his face peaceful now, and felt the pull of her own fears rise. The question lingered in her mind like an unanswered prayer. Was she enough to protect him, to stand by his side as the past came crashing into their present? In that moment, she made a silent vow. She would fight for him, for them, no matter what it took, and no matter the danger, she would face it with him. But what was she really facing? What exactly were they up against? She didn't know the answers yet, but she knew one thing with certainty. If they were going to survive this, they needed to be prepared. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps outside their tent. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there at this hour. Too quiet, too careful. Sienna froze, straining to hear more. There was no one who should be walking around the circus grounds at this time. The late hours belonged to the performers preparing for the next show or winding down after a long day. But this was different. There was something clandestine about the footsteps. Her heart thudded in her chest, a sense of urgency pressing against her ribcage. She glanced at Julian again, but he remained asleep, oblivious to the tension mounting in the air around them. Sienna slowly slid out of bed, her body moving with the same silent grace she had perfected on the trapeze. She reached for the small knife Julian had insisted she keep with her after their conversation, just in case. Her fingers brushed the cool metal as she tucked it into the waistband of her trousers, the weight of it offering a strange comfort. She glanced back at Julian one last time, making sure he was still asleep, then quietly pushed the tent flap open. Outside, The moonlight bathed the circus grounds in a pale glow. Shadows stretched long across the dirt, and the air was still except for the rustling of leaves in the trees. She took a cautious step forward, her senses heightened, listening for any further sign of movement. The footsteps stopped. Sienna's pulse quickened, but she held her ground, her breath steady despite the gnawing unease creeping up her spine. Whoever had been out there was now aware of her presence. She was about to step back into the tent when a figure emerged from the shadows, their face half obscured by a dark hood. Her breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" Sienna's voice came out sharper than she intended, her heart racing as she instinctively reached for the knife hidden at her side. The figure paused, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the trees, the crackling of the fire from the nearby performers' camp. Then, the hooded figure slowly pulled back the cloak that had concealed their face. Sienna's eyes widened. It was a woman. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the moonlight, her features angular and sharp, with deep, penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through Sienna. The woman's long black hair framed her face like a veil, and a thin scar ran down the left side of her neck, the only visible sign of a past life that Sienna couldn't begin to understand. "I don't mean to startle you," the woman said, her voice low, but carrying an air of authority. "I've been watching you." Sienna's heart skipped a beat. Watching her, the fear that had been simmering beneath her calm exterior suddenly surged to the forefront. She tightened her grip on the knife, though her instinct told her this woman wasn't here to hurt her. Not yet, anyway. "Who are you?" Sienna asked again, her voice less steady now, a tremor creeping in. "My name is Isolde," the woman said, "and I've been looking for you, Sienna." The mention of her name sent a ripple of confusion through Sienna's chest. How did this stranger know her? Isolde took a step closer, her eyes not leaving Sienna's face. "It's time you knew the truth," she said. "It's time you knew what's coming." Sienna's mind raced, a million questions flooding her, but one stood out among them all. What did this woman know about the danger Julian had warned her about? Before Sienna could speak, Isolde continued, "Julian isn't just running from his past. He's running from something much bigger. And you're a part of it now, whether you like it or not." Sienna's blood ran cold, the weight of her words sinking in. She had thought she was choosing a life with Julian, choosing to face the future together. But Isolde's cryptic warning suggested that her decision was not just about love. It was about survival. "Come with me," Isolde said, extending her hand. "I'll explain everything. But you have to trust me." Sienna hesitated, torn between the unknown and the life she had built with Julian. Sienna took a deep breath. The edge of fate had arrived, and there was no turning back. Trust. It was something she had given freely to Julian, but this was different. This felt like the edge of something much darker. Sienna took a deep breath. The edge of fate had arrived, and there was no turning back.